Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian, and today we're taking a look at a new reference book that has been released. This is FN Mauser Rifles by Anthony Vanderlinden. Now you may recognize that name if you have a bunch of other gun books. He's written some other material on FN products. I happen to have his book on FN Browning pistols here, which is also an excellent reference. This book specifically covers, as the title says, FN's Mauser Rifles. So it's not going to get into the pistols very much. It doesn't really get into things like the FAL or FN's myriad of other products. However, what's interesting to me is it kind of becomes clear that when he was writing this book, he intended it to be a book about Mauser rifles. But in order to write that, you kind of have to write a book about the FN company. And in order to write a useful, interesting, and contextual book on the FN company, you kind of have to write a book about the history of Belgium. And that's kind of what this became. I started into this book expecting, your kind of typical, rather dry reference material on a very specific niche subject, FN's, specifically Mauser rifles by FN. A pretty specific thing there. And what I found was actually a really engaging and interesting history of Belgium and FN and these rifles. And it really does a great job of putting them in context and, honestly, makes them a lot more interesting. In many ways, it's kind of hard to get excited about, ooh, this is the specific FN contract for Peru in 1935. Or, oh, how that contract differs from the Ecuadorian contract. There's a lot of minutiae in that sort of material, and Vanderlinden does a really good job of actually making you care about it. What's cool in this is so much has gone on in Belgium over the time that FN has been there and making guns. FN started out actually as a conglomeration of smaller manufacturers who wanted a joint contract to manufacture 1891 pattern Mauser rifles for the Belgian military. And none of these individual guys, guys like Piper and Frank Hott and others, none of them really had the facilities to fulfill the large military order by themselves, but they realized they could do well to share the wealth and unify and form this single entity in order to do this manufacturing. And that's what they did, and it became Fabrique Nationale, FN, and persisted to this very day, of course. So the story, of course, starts with the 1891 Mausers, and there's a decent bit of information in here on some of the prototypes and trials guns that were involved in the competition that eventually chose the 1891 Mauser. Those prototypes are really kind of a wacky bunch of rifles. There's very little information on them in general, and this kind of puts together everything that really is out there. So it's a good reference on that material to begin with. Then, of course, it's going to discuss the adoption and manufacture of the 1891. This was the rifle that was standard Belgian equipment going into World War I. They didn't have enough in World War I, of course, and they started losing guns in combat, so they needed more. And so there were a number of different things done to reestablish production of the 1891s, as well as the model of 1916 modified carbine version of the 1891. And so this discusses their development, their manufacture in the United States, where they were contracted out. Also discusses their manufacture in Birmingham, where, interestingly, this massive Belgian exodus of refugees when the Germans invaded, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Belgians ended up in the United Kingdom. And in particular, they ended up, among other things that they did there, they set up basically a miniature Belgian arms factory in Birmingham and took on their own manufacture and repair of Mauser rifles. So that's a really cool story to be able to read. At the end of World War I, FN as a company is left in this kind of awkward position where there's a massive economic depression. There's certainly no big market for military arms, so what do they do to survive? And interestingly, one of the things they do to survive is kind of lean much more heavily on their automotive division. People may not realize it, but FN was a substantial manufacturer of cars and motorcycles. And it was production of that sort of thing that really helped pick them up after World War I and again after World War II, when people didn't need arms, but they could use, for example, a cost-effective motorcycle, a good, reliable motorbike that would get you around, didn't cost nearly as much as a car, and here we are after the war, people have been unable to get motor vehicles for a long time because all that sort of production has been taken up by the war effort. So there's a market for that sort of thing, and FN exploits that basically to survive as a company. In fact, it's interesting. There's one picture in here of what is labeled as the author's, I believe, 1926 FN automobile, which is pretty cool. He clearly is very passionate about the story behind FN and the Belgian military and arms industry. So always cool to have an author with that sort of deep personal interest doing the book and doing the research, because I think it produces a much better result. At any rate, it's going to continue into the 1930s. There are a bunch of Mauser contracts that were filled by FN in the 1930s, and there's a lot of collector confusion as to exactly what these models are, how they differ. The Model 24, the Model 30, the Model 24/30, the Model 35, which doesn't actually exist. Vanderlinden is able to really clear up a lot of the kind of the murkiness behind what was a national contract, adoption year. So maybe the Peruvian government adopted a rifle as the Model something, but it was being sold by FN as the FN Model something else. What are all of those differences? And that's something there's not very much good information out there, or there wasn't until this book, which really clears a lot of that up, which is cool. One of the other particular elements that I enjoyed reading in here was discussion of the Belgian Congo. Again, there's kind of a lot of misunderstanding or misinformation out there about the nature of Belgium's colonial program. And then in particular, nobody really knows anything in general circles about what kind of guns did the Belgian Congo get? How did they use them? What was the military force in the Congo? Most people don't even really know the history of the Belgian Congo or the Congo Free State in general. So what happened to it? What was its political history, and how did that intersect with Belgium and FN and military supplies? And again, Vanderlinden's book here does a really cool job of discussing that in an interesting and a really engaging way. So then, of course, we're going to follow after World War II. There will be some more military contracts. Of course, the company is once again has to kind of bootstrap itself up into existence again. The FN plant took a couple of V1 bomb hits. It's interesting, FN was never directly targeted by the Allies for bombing because it's basically in a suburb of Liège, and it was deemed civilian casualties would be too risky to justify bombing the arms plant. So they were making parts and guns for the Germans, although it's interesting, there was a lot of sabotage going on. In particular, the machine cannons for the Me-262s were made so effectively sabotaged at Liège that they were never actually able to be put into service, those guns. Really cool, just little microcosm of the book. That's a really cool anecdote in there. Anyway, while the plant was never bombed by the Allies, after it was re-liberated and reoccupied by the Allies, the Germans did start dumping V1s on it, and the FN plant in particular took a couple of V1 hits towards the end of the war that really did a ton of damage. And so they had to pick up once again. And again, there's some cool anecdotes in here about American troops who happened to be on R&R in Liège, discovering that, hey, there's this weapons factory over there that's making pistols, and you can just go buy one. Because they were doing that. The parts that the Germans had left behind, the plant workers were able to assemble into working guns, and that was one of the small sources of income for the factory, even while the war was still going on. Again, there's a really cool anecdote in here about an American soldier who finds out about FN and wanders over there one day while he's on leave in Liège and goes to buy a pistol, and he doesn't really know. I mean, he's not a gun expert. He doesn't know much about it. He knows it's a pistol the Germans used. It turned out it was the high power, and his receipt says it's a Browning automatic pistol. And this guy just assumes, well, I'm sure they just put Browning on there because they knew we'd recognize Browning. He had no idea that Browning actually had contracted a great number of his designs to FN, and it was legitimately an FN Browning pistol that he had bought. Interesting little anecdotes like that are littered through this book. Of course, FN's Mauser production is going to really taper down and end after World War II, but there are a number of contracts still in there post-war, and of course production of high powers and that sort of thing. And it's going to end with a discussion of what happened to the FN company. leading right up to the present day. So I'm going a little bit long here, but there really is tremendously more information in this book than I had expected when I first got it. I thought this would be something that I would probably not ever read cover to cover, but I'd pull it out and flip through. Oh, I need, what was the serial number range for the Portuguese contract or whatever. Turns out, no, I actually read this thing literally cover to cover in a couple evenings. It was very engaging, and I think it's a great book for anyone who's let me back up a step. What's interesting about this is you don't have to be someone who's really enthusiastically interested in Belgium or FN to appreciate and really enjoy this book. What Vanderlinden is able to do is actually, I think, create a real appreciation for the country and the company and the rifle through the process, or through the book, which is important. Let's be honest. FN Mauser rifles aren't exactly the sexiest thing ever conceived of for a book, but it's really cool. I would strongly encourage this for anyone who's interested in military history and geopolitics, because it opens up a story that you didn't know you were going to be interested in. So the best place to get a copy of it is actually Vanderlinden's website, fnbrowning.com. If you order through there, because you can get it through other dealers, Amazon, etc. But if you order through fnbrowning.com, you'll get an autographed copy like this one, which is a cool little extra to have, and of course helps support the author in an industry that's not doing so well these days. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you guys go out there and get a copy of this book, because it really is much more interesting and much more worthwhile than you would expect. Thanks for watching.